Good evening, folks. It's Sunday night, so once more I've taken over Socialist Telly, aided and abetted by my brilliant co-host Sarah Grant. Here once more to highlight a key social issue with a panel of very special guests. And tonight we're joined by representatives of SafeEdForAll, Sarah Hoppy Saul, Claire Kosler, Lisa Diaz, and Sugra Nazir. Welcome to you all. How are you?
Great, thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
Great, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Now, prior to my involvement with Socialist Telly, I'd done an interview with Parents United, Brutus, the Boycott Return to Unsafe Schools, about sending kids back to school during the pandemic. It was already quite widely appreciated then, some 6 months ago now, that they were an obvious source of transmission, with so many people of all age groups all in close proximity to each other. Like those groups, you're a parent-led organisation. You want schools to be a safe place for learning, but we simply aren't there yet, despite government claims. Let's start a bit with an introduction to SafeEdForAll, about who you are, what you do, and how you came into being.
Do you want me to take this, lady?
Yeah.
Okay, very basically, we all met, we all joined, we're all followers of Parents United. We all had various issues and concerns about return to school without any of the scientifically recognised mitigations that are in place in any other indoor setting where households mix. We had concerns. We were following Parents United. We then, I think Lisa and another founding member, Jason, sort of found me and found others of us as waifs and strays out there in the Twitter sphere who were all campaigning on various issues. Mine particularly was about freedom of choice to use a mask in a secondary school, which was a nightmare fight that I was going through with a multi-academy trust. But we all have various different issues. Some of our members are CV, or have CV or CV kids. And we sort of started as a support network with a WhatsApp chat, all sharing our stories and all sharing ideas and suggestions of what we could do. And then about November last year, we said, well, I think we need to do a little bit more than just talking amongst ourselves in our little echo chamber. And so we sort of started campaigning properly and gathering some more information. We were following basically the scientific information that was coming from Independent Sage that is in their schools report, the information that was being given by the educators themselves from the various unions. And we just wanted to say, look, we're parents feeling exactly the same way, following the science, actually following the science, not just saying we're following the science. And what can we do to try and raise more awareness that this isn't happening in our schools? The constant mantra of schools are safe is so demoralizing to us. We know they're not safe. My children did go back in September with masks after the fight, but they still had 3 periods of isolation, and my 14-year-old did contract COVID in school and was tested positive on the 8th of December, was ill for 19 days. And when I say ill, I don't mean he didn't have to be hospitalised, and we weren't concerned for his long-term health at that stage, even though I'm working with long COVID kids. But he didn't return to pre-infection health and still has no sense of taste or smell, and has what they refer as COVID toe, which is blistered toes, which seems a common symptom. So even now, with a 6 foot tall, previously very healthy, very athletic 14-year-old, he's not returned to pre-infection health. So I question, as all parents do, how is it morally or legally acceptable to knowingly expose children and school staff and their families, because children do catch it and children do transmit, to an airborne virus? Why aren't the mitigations in place? We all want education to continue and be safe and sustainable and fair to all, but that can't happen if you're knowingly allowing exposure to the virus without putting anything in place. So that's where we are at the minute. We're still fighting the fact that schools are resisting, and whether it's individual schools, I'm not sure. The constant thing we get from schools when we challenge them individually as parents is we're following the guidance. So it's the guidance that needs to change, and be scientifically based guidance, not what's convenient to run a school. Anybody else?
Anybody else want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say there. So I think one of the things that's been really difficult about this debate has been that views have been very polarised around whether schools should be open or closed. And what we've been very clear about is saying that it's much broader than that. There are lots of reasons why our children should be in school, but only if it's safe. And I think the other thing that we've been very keen to do is stress that actually, although it's a parent-led campaign, we're very mindful of the need to include school staff, education staff. And that's where really the kind of ethos behind SafeEdForAll is, that it's about the children, it's about the parents, but it's also very much about creating an environment that's going to be safe for employment or people that are employed in schools.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite telling thing, I think, that this is the latest in a number of groups that are parent-led, that have sprung up since this COVID crisis began, that are trying to raise awareness of the issues surrounding schools and the fact that the government has consistently tried to resist it. I mean, not once at any point have teachers been prioritised for the vaccination programme, so to speak. The long COVID issue, which a number of times has been raised regarding children, is not one that is reported on widely. I'm glad to hear that your 14-year-old has recovered to an extent, but as you say, it is only to an extent. He's not back to full health, so this is worrying. And when this crisis has not been around for very long, and is still rather poorly understood, especially when what it holds for the future, for example, it's of great concern. And of course, we've now come out of our third lockdown, and this government has gone from remote teaching to get all the kids back, which is just stupefying, the way they've decided to open the schools up to everybody all at once. And they keep claiming they're following the science, but they very much aren't. They were warned about schools reopening and that this could lead to a rise in cases last year by their own SAGE scientists, as well as being warned against eat out to help out and reopening at Christmas and stuff like that. The warnings came to pass. I spoke to independent SAGE scientist Dr. Gabriel Scally 2 weeks ago, who explained that there has been no programme of work to make schools COVID safe. And with the new, now dominant variant of COVID known to be more airborne, what was your reaction to this move by the government a few weeks ago when they decided to reopen? What should they be doing, do you think, to make schools safe?
Can I go, Lisa?
I'll speak. Yeah. Well, governments have gone against SAGE science. We're not even looking at independent SAGE. Their own scientists said the Big Bang reopening will lead to an excess of 30,000 deaths and will push the I rate above 1. So this isn't just a group of parents who have come together who are concerned. The government aren't even following their own science. They're not following the 9 education unions. All we are asking for as parents is the same mitigations as every other workplace and indoor space. We're not asking for much. Tell me another place where you would have 32 bodies crammed together, inadequate, unmeasured ventilation, no social distancing, no mask. So when the school and the LA come back to me and said, we're following the guidelines, that's of no consequence, because the guidelines are not worth the paper they're written on. We all know this. This isn't my opinion. This is UNICEF. This is the WHO. This is the independent SAGE. So I get really angry and upset with the gaslighting. And then to add insult to injury, and this is quite pertinent for me at the moment, and a lot of other mums, we are bullied. And it is mainly women, unfortunately. And listen, it's I support any men, any parents at all who are going through this. But to be told that not only could I be fined, but I got an actual email from the school saying that I could be prosecuted and jailed. And this is the reality. Okay?
Take your time.
I'm fine. Yeah, sorry. I also got told explicitly in 2 emails by the head teacher that my children could be off-rolled, that they would be off-rolled, that she couldn't keep them on. That is nonsense. She's not got the power. And if she did off-roll them, she'd be breaking the law. I send in work every single day. I'm trying my best. And believe you me, I want my kids to be in school. They want to be in school, but it's got to be safe. If Boris Johnson said to me, send your kids into that burning building, I wouldn't do it. And I won't send them into an environment that is highly conducive to the spread of COVID-19. The one thing that Labour have said is that they condemn fining parents. They condemn sanctioning parents, okay? And some local authorities, for example, Leeds, Sucre will be able to correct me, Sandwell and Norfolk, sorry. Yeah. They've all said, we're not interested in fining parents. Sandwell said not until after Easter we'll look at it again. But, Leeds and the other one, Norfolk, said we're not interested in it. So LAs do have the discretion not to persecute parents. And it's not happening. And, I wrote to Lisa and Andy and she sent me a nice reply back saying, the Labour Party don't support fines. She can't find a public health official who says, yeah, it's a good idea to support, to fine parents. But it's still going on. And, the idea that we're just following the guidance, we're just following orders is a weak line of defence. And it has been historically. And it's got to stop because vulnerable people, vulnerable families, vulnerable women are being criminalised and it stinks and it has to stop. No, there is no excuse.
No. It's not just about criminalising though, is it? I mean, I gave evidence to the APPG, really incredibly difficult to tell my story. I think you've got a government on the one hand that's saying people like me need to shield. So they, tell you that you're not allowed to go to work. You mustn't go to the shops. Don't go out. At one point the message was pack your hospital bag, write your will and look out of the window. But then at the same time, the same government is saying I should then send my teenage daughters into a school with 1,000 others traveling by public transport. The bubbles collapsed very quickly. They ended up with interrupted learning. And the message I got back from the school was, we're following the guidance and actually you've lived your life. So do you not think you should be prioritising your children's education over your own life? And obviously highly emotive, incredibly difficult conversations for people like myself to have, to then say, well, actually, no, I was a person who lost the dad very early on. I know what that feels like. So please don't tell me that it's going to be worse for them to miss school than actually losing a parent.
There's been some incredibly callous behaviour around.
Absolutely appalling.
In the middle of this, I lost my dad and I got,
you did.
Don't care if you're grieving, get on with the homeschooling. No, you can't have any time off. We've all had really bad just comments that in normal time would be absolutely unacceptable, haven't we?
We have, and I think the really frustrating thing for us was before Christmas, some excellent work done with Mark MacDonald and the Public Interest Law Centre, and they were very, very clear and issued a briefing note for the attention of local authorities and head teachers to say that schools absolutely have discretion. So please don't feel that you've got to implement the government guidance to the letter. You know your families, you know the risks, and exercise discretion around authorising absence, make available remote learning, suspend fines, but we're not seeing that consistently. In fact, what we're seeing is the families that are in touch with us, the same local authorities will, on the one hand, allow some parents to be off, and yet inexplicably, there are other families who have vulnerabilities, equal or more sort of risks or issues, and yet they're not being supported. We don't blame the schools necessarily. Some of them actually have behaved abominably, but actually it's about the guidance. And even having had that sort of pre-law or pre-action letter and a briefing before Christmas, the new guidance that came out before the big bang in February, March time actually continued to restate government expectations that local authorities would make attendance mandatory, and said, and local authority support is available for schools to pursue sanctions against parents. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, for God's sake. You're depriving people of economic support. You're telling people to shield without no support or isolation payments, you know, world beating, we are definitely not. And then on top of that, you're expecting us to send our children into school.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, I think those are some excellent, salient, very salient points that have been made there. And thank you, especially Lisa, for that emotive response you gave there. I think you've summed up the feelings of an awful lot of parents who are in a very similar boat. And it's, as an organisation yourselves, as parents, you want to support the schools in order to deal with this and the fact that they haven't had a lot of support. But when the schools themselves are not reciprocating that, it makes it awfully difficult for that to be facilitated. And of course, different local education authorities, academies, quite often the buck stops with the head teachers, and actually they have an awful lot of say if they're prepared to use it. I mean, they can quash fines if they don't want to administer them, for example. Some truly harrowing stuff that we are hearing from schools there. And it's absolutely inexcusable. It doesn't help the parents. It certainly doesn't help the children. And nowhere does the situation improve, because without that solidarity, without that collectivism there, I mean, you get together, you get all these the schools and the parents all singing this from the same hymn sheet. You've got an awful lot of clout and an awful lot of power, and people have to listen to that. And we've seen that in recent days, for example, with the protests that we've seen at Clapham Common and what's come about from that. And other things besides that as well. As I said a moment ago, I interviewed Dr. Gabriel Scally from Independent Sage the other week. I just want to read you out what he said on schools and get your take on that. He said, "I think schools are an enormous worry, and there is, of course, no vaccine approved yet for people under age 18. So it's going to be a huge kind of reservoir of non-immune people, these children and young people in school. And there's a real difficulty, especially being the way the government is doing it, intending to do it, bringing everyone back across England into all the schools at once. I think that's just remarkable. And it's remarkable because what hasn't happened is that there hasn't been a program of work with those schools to make things safe, to make them COVID safe. And by that, I mean things like ventilation. I think ventilation is extraordinarily important. We know that this variant that's dominant now is even more infectious than the previous one. And we know that it's spread by air. And we should have had a whole program of works aimed at improving the ventilation in all of our schools, making sure it was up to scratch in all of our schools, that the contrast with elsewhere is remarkable. If you were a parent with a child in the public health school system in New York City, you will have a report available to you on your school. You will be told the number of classrooms that your child is in. Every room has a unique identifier. And you'll be told the number of the class that your child will be in, and you'll be able to read the report on the ventilation of that room, whether it's got windows, whether those windows are capable of being opened, whether there is a ventilation system which extracts the air from the classroom, whether there's a ventilation system that pushes it into the classroom from outside, whether there is mechanical ventilation and air conditioning system, whether there's a filter on that air conditioning system, and how effective the filter is against the virus. All of that you will have at your fingertips if you're a parent. And what we haven't seen is the program of works that I would like to see, which is also taking over of community facilities, halls, unused facilities at the moment in the hospitality industry, conferencing facilities, putting up temporary buildings which could be well ventilated to give classes more space so that you're better spaced out and the buildings are better ventilated. And I would like to see them do things in a staggered return and have also high hygiene standards. Well, what was happening in the NHS, he remembers when they were taking wash basins out of wards in the NHS, and all of a sudden they had MRSA problems in hospitals. We need good hygiene facilities. Should be improved hygiene facilities, hand washing facilities in all schools, and we should seriously look at mask wearing for all children over the age of 6 as well. And good quality, provided free, suitable for children to wear, and with good instruction on hygiene on ventilation, and all the aspects of a safe school for everyone. What do you make of those words?
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. And it defies any kind of logic that we've been in this situation since March last year. 12 months since the whole schools were closed, apart from to vulnerable and key worker children. So 12 whole months. And what you would expect in those 12 months was by September opening, that should have all happened. There should have been planned, funded, implemented maybe Nightingale classrooms if the space isn't, if you can't, trying to understand that there are certain constraints with the school, that you can't make a classroom bigger magically, and you can't make children disappear and have reduced class sizes without doing something. So without looking at rota systems or blended learning or Nightingale classrooms or using the sports hall rather than the classrooms, or there's loads of things they could have done, marquees outside for lunch times. There's so many things that they could have done. And don't tell me they didn't have the money, and don't tell me they didn't have the time, because that's the two things they needed to get the right things in place, and they're abundantly available for any other issue. If it's about getting pubs and hospitality open again, they were willing to use the eat out to spread it about scheme or whatever. There was no effort whatsoever to do the same with schools. We keep coming back to the same thing. Let's deal with the facts. Children are human beings. Human beings get COVID. Human beings transmit COVID. If you're going to stick 30 members of a different household in an 8 metre by 8 metre space, and I'm being generous, most classrooms are a bit
generous, I was going to say.
I was going to say, I'm being generous. You're going to stick them in an indoor space, and your guidance to that school to make that indoor space safe, a COVID safe environment. Don't forget, schools are safe. It's just the mixing of households within them that's dangerous. You're going to tell them to open the windows. Well, as I said in my first meeting with school, when they said, well, we'll have the windows open, I said, well, that'll be fun in Newcastle in November. And she laughed, the teacher laughed and went, well, let them keep the coats on if they need to. Right, okay, that's not a solution as far as I'm concerned. And they're not adhering to that guidance in some cases. And I'm not blaming the schools, I'm blaming the lack of education to the school leaders from the DFE, which should have been, the guidance should have been based on scientific evidence of transmission and infection control. They should be the ones saying, yeah, closing the windows cannot happen. If you've got no other ventilation monitoring, when it gets rainy and cold, you can't close the window and let it steam up, because it's an airborne virus. Sitting all 30 pupils, as they do at my son's school, facing forward, makes no difference. Are you telling me that this virus, when it's exhaled, if someone is asymptomatic, only travels forward? It's ridiculous. And everybody that you speak to says, at the minute, I can't go and have a birthday party in a pub with 30 friends of mine in an indoor space. Quite right. That's to prevent transmission. Yet my children, for 6 hours a day, can go, their bubbles are 300. So my household is connected with 2 boys to 600 other households on a daily basis for 6 hours a day.
And can't have a funeral with 30 people.
Exactly.
Masked.
Exactly. But so the logic isn't there. And I hate to say it, I'm not blaming the schools at all. You know, we support all of those teachers and all of the unions who are trying to do everything to raise awareness that they need a safe working environment, and telling a teacher to stand behind a taped 2 metre space and you'll be all right isn't enough. Telling people to wash their hands, catch it, bin it, kill it, that's not going to stop the spread of COVID. When you're
hand sanitizer, the favourite. My son's school's risk assessment involves protecting staff, nothing about children, and lots of hand sanitizer. That's it. It's hand sanitizer. And we're not unsympathetic. I mean, a couple of us are actually ex-teachers. You know, we know the situation. We know they're not getting the support from the DFE. It's not us against schools and we're horrible parents who hate schools. Far from it.
Absolutely. I think they've simply missed out. And I think we've talked about this sort of mantra around children, and every single letter that you get from schools, everything in the risk assessment is that children don't get it, or if they do get it, they don't transmit it. Yet before Christmas, the SAGE report was that children aged between 12 and 17 were 7 times more likely to be the index case. They pick it up and they take it home. And what we're seeing is this sort of repetition, you know, from March onwards, there's a failure to recognise that COVID is airborne. So all the risk mitigation that you see that needs to be suitable and sufficient does not focus on the fact that COVID is airborne. So using the simplest of analogies, we've spoken about and looked at models where somebody smokes a cigarette, and where does that smoke go? It doesn't all just neatly flow forwards. And what we see in responses to outbreaks or when cases happen, what some of the schools have ended up doing is saying, and we see the headlines every day, a deep clean after outbreak in school. Washing and wiping the surfaces isn't going to kill it. We can't wash it, bin it, kill it, as Sarah said.
My son's school's currently got, I haven't sent him back, but I got an email saying we've got an outbreak of head lice. At the same time as I got the letter saying that I was being fined for not sending him back to school, but assuring me the social distancing was happening. Well, unless head lice have evolved a magical quality of jumping 6 to 7 feet, which they don't, I'm an ex-teacher, how? Exactly. How is this happening? They can't, at the same time have head lice and be social distancing. It's just not happening. In my son's risk assessment, there's a 3-page procedure on what the staff member has to do to keep themselves safe if a child with suspected COVID needs the toilet before they go home. But there's 3 lines about the children, 3 lines, because it's presumed they don't catch COVID, and it's not true.
No, I mean, the head lice, sorry, I'm just going to jump in. Head lice is the classic example of how social distancing in schools does not work. Because if social distancing was working in schools, head lice would be on the verge of extinction right now. Because as you say, they don't jump, they crawl. They, when kids are in close proximity, they move from one head to another, and that's the only way they spread. I just want to bring Lisa. It does, even though I haven't got any hair left.
And we all go,
it's really head lice with me. I'm just going to bring Lisa in. She had her hand up a moment ago, and I'll come back to you, Sugra, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Lisa?
I forgot what I was going to say. I think it was around everything that you said before, Damien, regarding what they're doing in New York, regarding what is required in terms of using spaces. None of this is controversial stuff. It is basic. Every other civilized society is doing this already. Why are we so behind? Independent Sage have been screaming this from the rooftop since last summer. They've been saying we need social distancing, we need Nightingale hospitals, and there is absolutely zilch interest from the government to protect our children. There's money for the donors for Circle, Track and Trace. How much are we up to in that? 37 billion. I can't get my head around what 37 billion looks like. So that's been spaffed on that. What is it to make our kids safe? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And, it's indicative of the cruelty of this government. And then, sorry, coming back to the sanctioning again, parents who refuse to believe the lie that schools are safe get sanctioned and bullied, and it's got to stop.
Sugra?
I was just going to say that really it beggars belief that, having seen the enormity and the scale of deaths, I work in the social care sector, so obviously I could do another program with you around the protective ring that we have or haven't seen around care homes and the impact that that's had on those residents. But in the same way, even where schools and local authorities have put their head above the parapet, and we saw in the north, the Focus Trust before Christmas deciding, actually, in terms of risk mitigation, we will close a week early, so that we've got that. They were stopped from doing that. We've seen news in the last couple of days about the weakness of the case against Greenwich, when Greenwich as a local authority were blocked in terms of the actions they were trying to do. What we're seeing time and time again is there isn't a focus on risk mitigation in order to eradicate or go towards a zero COVID sort of strategy. It's more about containment and actually managing the spread.
And I know wildly dependent on the authority as well.
We talk about herd immunity, and I think they're quite comfortable around this idea that the children will pick it up, they'll spread it, we'll contain it. And what we'll do is it's appalling that we're using words like tolerable deaths with a best case scenario of 30,000. I don't want to be part of that collateral damage. And I'm fed up of hearing about the vaccines. I think it's brilliant, and well done, and fair play to the NHS, not the private sector, who've implemented the vaccines in the way that they have. But what we talk about is parents. A lot of parents haven't had the vaccines yet. The people that have had the vaccines are at the end of the transmission chain. They're the old people. They're the people that were shielding. So parents haven't had the vaccines. A lot of the teachers haven't had the vaccines. The children haven't. There's a lot of parents who are allergic and can't have the vaccine. The people that have had it, they've had one dose. Some of them, it's been the Pfizer, and actually the government's dosing frequency goes against the manufacturer's guidance. And we're hearing now, amongst all this sort of political debate and whatever going on, there's also issues around supply. So there's no guarantee that the people who are still waiting will get their vaccine as promised. And there are people who will then go about with half a dose, which will have waning effectiveness. And then my last bit is, you can live in an area like mine, which now has the Brazil variant. So actually there is absolutely no guarantee, and we don't know yet how effective the vaccines will be against the variants and mutations that are coming through.
There's some more, actually. There's a new variant in Brittany, the Breton variant. This started in Lannion. There's 79 people, 8 people dead, and they reckon, one, it's undetectable. My sister-in-law's from Rio Grande do Sul, the part of Brazil which is actually called out for international help. It's that bad. The hospitals don't even have places anymore. But there's no mitigation against any of these variants in British schools. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And in the meantime, like Lisa said, we've got heads threatening us. I'm currently on a, if your son doesn't go back to school on Monday, you're being fined. I've already had this once. I sent him back in December, and I kicked myself for doing it because it meant I couldn't go and see my parents. In the meantime, my father died. I lost my last chance to see my dad because they forced my son back to school.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Claire.
And then they were incredibly callous about my dad's death. And it's been like this all along. And I got in this letter, it said, oh, Caspian's been at school for 18 days in the last year. Well, one, they haven't been open for most of that. 2, in the middle of which I was dealing with a family tragedy. And I've got care commitments for my mother. She's 86 and at the other end of the country, which makes it really easy. And there's no, and I'm just one story. I also have disabilities, and I've been treated like, why aren't you doing homeschooling today? Well, I have disabilities. I'm not always good. I have fibromyalgia, I have ME, and I have EDS. It's a very up and down condition. Yes. I can't always tell what I'm going to be like in the morning. On top of that, I've got long COVID, by the way, because I got it right at the very beginning because my partner's an ambulance driver. So, and there's been no understanding. I think the other thing is no understanding of the fact that all family dynamics are different. We've all been through different stuff. Lisa's is different to Sarah's, is different to Sugra's, is different to mine. And every other parent in school, people have been through loss, people have been through tragedy, people have been through illness, people are still dealing with illness, like Sarah with her son. And it's a one size fits all. And then the other thing seems to be that local authorities, like I'm Lancashire, which is a Tory local authority, and some of them are taking it literally as a license to print money, I think. They are just enforcing willy-nilly, and then other authorities are being fined. It either has to apply across the country, or discretion has to apply across the country, or better still, like we really want, the actual mitigations need to apply across the country, and then we'll all send our kids back to school, because I don't think any of us fit the typical profile of a truanting parent. None of us did this before the pandemic.
No, of course not. What an awful situation to have to work through, and my sympathies with fibromyalgia. My wife suffers from it as well. It's a fully understood condition. Lisa, one final point before I move on.
All I was going to say is, I'm just lowering my hand. No, I think often children are thought, another myth that's perpetuated by the government is that children don't get it bad. Okay, they may be most likely to be asymptomatic, and there's a smaller, although one child's death is one death too many, it goes without saying, but the thing is long COVID in kids, and because it's not in the government's interest to talk about long COVID in children. The ONS figures say that of children who test positive for COVID, 1 in 7 secondary school children will have symptoms after 5 weeks, and that's 1 in 8 in primary school. Okay, so the fact that we're exposing our children to a disease and we have got absolutely no idea of the long-term implications, but this is serious. It's not just like a little bit of a post-viral, you know, a bit of a cold or this. We're talking about kids who end up in a wheelchair, who have organ damage, who can't breathe properly. They don't know if they're ever going to get better. They're fighting this a year on. Why isn't this all over the news? It's an absolute tragedy. And in England alone, there are now over 80,000 children who are suffering from long COVID. That I'm not, you know, varying degrees of it. But given that it is new, and even the cleverest, the best scientists in the world don't know enough about it yet, why is it morally or legally acceptable to expose our children to this risk with no mitigations, like the ones that you spoke about earlier, Damien?
Yeah, I mean, morally and legally, they don't always go hand in hand, of course. There's plenty of laws around that have been awful, that have been absolutely chronic. And of course, the other side of this is the fact that we're facing a vaccine shortage coming up. We're hearing in the news. So for all the delays there's been between the 2 doses of vaccine, and of course, a lot of adults still haven't had it because they've been focusing on older adults or those with underlying health issues. There are some that perhaps are facing not getting it at all. And of course, this then has a knock-on effect, because what hope have children got for any protection if the adults aren't being protected? Dr. Scally made the point that there's no vaccine approved for anyone under the age of 18 already anyway. And it's because there's been this assumption that they don't get it badly, therefore we don't need to worry about it. But as has been rightly said, we don't know enough about the long-term effects of long COVID, which children do seem to be particularly more susceptible to see where this is going to lead them in a direction of health in the future. But what struck me most about what Dr. Scally said, it's just amazing what other countries are capable of doing. And it does come down to political will on what you're prepared to spend money on. They're prepared to spend money on renewing Trident and nuclear weapons, but they're not prepared to invest in the NHS. They're prepared to give £1 billion to keep themselves in power to the DUP. There's a magic money tree for that, but there isn't for something else. There is, the £37 billion to Serco track and trace that Lisa mentioned. We did a roundup on this the other week, and I did some maths on this, and £37 billion, to try and visualize what that looks like. It's a stack of £20 notes, 130 miles long. So think about where you live and what's 130 miles away from where you live, and consider that's a stack of 20s, not end to end, stacked 20s spanning that distance. It's a preposterous amount of money. And for what? Something that doesn't work. But of course, when the government repeatedly fails, as they have repeatedly done, you expect that the opposition would have a field day with it. But unfortunately, we have one led by Keir Starmer, and on this topic, his Shadow Education Secretary, Kate Green. You had a response from Green on Wednesday night, I believe. What did she have to say?
So we wrote to her, and we were surprised to get a response so quickly. We really were. And our letter basically outlined all of our concerns we've talked about here, and we begged her, basically, as our opposition, please, can you do 2 things? We know there's limits to what she can do. Do 2 things. Firstly, stand up and publicly announce that Labour do not agree with fining parents during a global pandemic. Bring us in line with Wales and Scotland, who have both said that's not happening. Do that publicly, say that. And the second thing was publicly show support for mask use in schools. Already, they've only been introduced into secondaries and it's not mandatory. And they're talking about removing that option, that use of them in classrooms after Easter. No idea why. Arbitrary discussion of we'll keep them until Easter and then we'll review it. Don't know why. Meanwhile, we have serious anti-masker campaigns, and I'm not even going to mention the name of the parent group who say they're a parent group, but they're really linked to CRG and lobbyists and whatever, who are sending anonymous letters to head teachers, quasi-legal ones, saying that if you force a child to wear a mask, you are committing child abuse, which I hate that term being bandied about the use of a recognised scientific measure to prevent the inhalation of an aerosol, an airborne virus. To call it child abuse, to educate and explain to children the principles and the reasons why it's used. It really drives me mad. So we asked for those two things. So our response, the first part of the letter explains how vitally important it is for children to be back in school, how children have missed so much education right now and they're falling behind and there's serious concerns about their mental health. All of those I have no problem with. Yes, there are serious concerns. If mitigations were in place, there wouldn't have been remote learning for a majority of children. They would have continued with an education provision that was sustainable throughout this time. So I'm not negating those points. The next part went on that Labour do not agree with fining parents. Okay, that's good. It's in the letter, but you're not publicly announcing that, but it's in the letter. And then said, we think schools should work to reassure parents who have concerns. Well, explain to me how you can reassure me without doing anything different. You can tell me schools are safe as much as you like, and I can tell you they're not. Otherwise, why would my son have contracted COVID at school in December? Why would he have had to be isolated 3 times prior to that because he was a close contact? If they're safe, that wouldn't be happening. There would be no transmission whatsoever. There would be no isolation, and education would have been sustainable. So telling me that schools should work to reassure parents, that's just not going to cut it. How do you reassure me? Do something, then I'll be reassured. Tell me they're safe and tell me, oh yes, but we're going to keep the windows open and we're going to keep them in their bubbles of 300. That doesn't reassure me. So yes, I am extremely disappointed in the response we've received. I think all of us are. We were pleased to receive a response, because when we wrote to Matt Hancock asking him to do something similar, which is to speak to the DfE and say, from a public health perspective, you're damaging all of the gains we've had, all of the lockdown, all of the reducing transmission rate by opening schools with a big bang. You're going to put that at jeopardy. And we got no response from that. But to be fair, we didn't expect a response. So we were happy to receive a response and happy that someone's listening, but do something. Don't tell me quietly in a letter and tell me that parents need to be reassured and schools are the best place for children. I'm not negating that they need an education, and in-person education is the way to go. However, do something. Yeah, that's what I'm disappointed at.
We've had no support, have we, really? I think we've just been so disappointed, and there's been so many missed opportunities to actually oppose what's going on and to prevent this level of catastrophic harm that's gone on in terms of deaths. I mean, and the mental health argument, there's been a chronic underfunding of CAMHS and mental health support services for children, and we're seeing very much the legacy impact of that. But at no point are we getting that point made. So when people start using the catch-up rhetoric, we're not getting the opposition parties to stand up and say, what about the millions and billions of pounds that should have gone into these services over the last 10 years? Yeah. What impact has that had on our children?
The catch-up rhetoric, who are we catching up with? We're all in the same boat. We've all been through the same thing. Even our closest neighbours in Europe. Who are we catching up with? Which imaginary person? It's just another license to print money for one of their friends, isn't it?
We know it's gone to the private sector, and there's reports today of somebody sitting in Hong Kong who's under 18, paid at £1.74 an hour, untested, no DBS, when actually there were the mechanisms in place. Give that money to schools so they can actually target the families that need support, in the same way that the laptops program was rolled out and the contracts were given to another company, and some schools reported having, the irony of it, a virus infected laptop delivered.
Ours kept going wrong. It took 4 months for them to actually give us one.
Yeah, which they've now taken back.
Which they've now taken back, and they've withdrawn all right to home learning. My son is SEN, my son is autistic, my son has bowel issues, my son has asthma, and my son, the last time he got really ill, this set off all his food refusal problems. But they want me to send him back in the middle of this. Oh, and there's no separate risk assessment for all of those things either. So he has to go to a quiet room. I said, are there bubbles in the quiet room? I'm not getting any answer. But what Sugra said about CAMHS, I mean, I've also got, it's affecting your son's mental health. Yeah. Well, I asked for a referral to my son for the food refusal issues, but that's nearly 5 years ago now. We still haven't got that referral. So, solve the problems rather than putting it all on the children's mental health, because you're not going to do anything about that either. Fund CAMS,
Yeah. Lisa, can I bring you back in?
I think, I can't add anything to what anyone said. The only thing I would stress is Labour, we need a voice. It's no good writing, agreeing, it's really cruel to fine parents. That's great. But you're the opposition. We need you now. We need you to stand up and do something about it. We need you to be having a word with your local authorities. It's all right writing it in letters to your constituents that it's not on and you disagree with it. Well, say it. This whole "now is not the time" mantra. If now is not the time in the middle of a deadly pandemic, when is? We need you now.
Yeah. Starmer's response to getting kids back to school: no ifs or buts, no equivocation. He repeated it in March, and it's such a risible, weak stance to take to support the government, that you're in a position that you're there to oppose and to scrutiny and to hold to account, and you're not doing it. And we had Rebecca Long Bailey in Kate Green's post beforehand, who was working with the teachers unions to ensure kids and staff were safe upon their return. And we saw her removed from post under the most pathetic of reasons, frankly, but it's made to look all the more pathetic since Starmer has never to date called for any Conservative minister to be sacked. And when it comes to COVID and schools, people like Matt Hancock or Gavin Williamson, they're really open targets for this. The number of times, the number of reasons he could have called for their resignation and never has, nothing. And of course, he's recently called for Nicola Sturgeon to go as well. So he's falling into this trap of being hard on women now as well as anything else.
But it's a failure. It's a failure, Damien. It's like an abdication of responsibility, and it's a failure to actually challenge and attack. But actually, by not mounting that opposition, it's collusion then with the oppression of some of the most vulnerable people. And actually, the votes that I know it's a critical time of year now, but the votes that they lost over Brexit, they will also now continue to lose, because there are people, vulnerable people in households, part of the Labour heartlands. I'm from Bradford, we've got 3 Labour MPs. The Conservative estimates are there's 700,000 children at home. There's 60 or 70,000 isolating at the moment. There are over 570 teaching staff that have died. There are people like me that are in the 3 million excluded from financial support. Those numbers stack up. And unless we get the support of Labour, actually, who will we turn to when it comes to voting?
Sorry, go on.
All I was going to say is it seems what Starmer is trying to do is trying to please everyone, and in doing that he's going to please absolutely no one. If you want to vote Tory, you'll go out and do it. So given this Tory light option of not really opposing anything and saying we support the government, I don't know which votes he's trying to win, but all he's doing is alienating people like me who, I was in the Labour Party. I can't support that anymore now. I've left the Labour Party for the reason is utter failure on schools. He must know they're not safe.
I'm hanging on by the skin of my teeth, but it's not going to be long. Sarah.
Yeah. Sarah G.
Which Sarah?
Come in.
Poppy.
Yeah. So bearing in mind we can't rely on Labour Party to defend you and stick up for you, what can activists watching this now, what can they do to help you?
Go ahead, Lisa, you take that one.
Do you know what? I'm at the stage now where I think I have tried. I've written reams of emails with scientific evidence, with reasoning why schools aren't safe, and they've just been ignored. They've been knocked back. The only response I've ever had is that we are following the government guidelines, and our hands are tied. the only way I think now is to fight fire with fire, to go to the media, to tell your story. So, for example, I went to my local media, just so frustrated. It's not what I wanted to do, but after 6 months and of just getting nowhere, and then the threats carried on. It was even being put in the school newsletter, and I got a couple of messages from my parents saying, "How bad is that? How callous is that in a pandemic that they're putting in the newsletter?" But it just shows, is it the pressure from the government? It's anarchy. Everyone's doing their own little thing. Like I said, you've got Leeds who are saying, "Oh yeah, we're not going to fine." You've got Wigan saying, "Yeah, we're going to start fining you now." So I think what we need to do is we do need collective action. Like our group here, anybody who is struggling, come forward and we will support you. I would say go to your local media, expose them, because there's no other way than shaming them, highlighting how cruel and callous that they are. We need to change the narrative. My kids are actually happy learning at home. All right, of course they miss the friends, but all of this about, they've not got mental health issues, doing a bit of home learning, they're getting time. I mean, I am in a lucky position and, working from home, and I appreciate it's not that easy for everyone, but I should imagine that having a mum on a ventilator might have a more profound impact on their mental health, or killing the gran, or ending up with long COVID. What's that going to do on the mental health? Why is this utterly ignored? So, sorry, back to your original question. We need to go to we need to keep lobbying our politicians. We need to go to the media. We need to tell our stories. And the other thing is, the only thing that kind of makes their ears prick up kind of thing is they're not bothered about it not being safe. They're not bothered about long COVID in kids. Is the law? Do government guidelines supersede health and safety legislation? Sarah, because you're shaking your head and you know a lot more than I do about this.
Yeah, I would just like to say, thanks for asking, Sarah, what more can people do? We've established that the mainstream media, with very few exceptions, will not look at the safety mitigations in school. They'll talk quite happily and do full page spreads on the mental health impacts of remote learning and school closures, as they say. Those schools have never been closed. And they'll do lots on the impact of children, or they'll say things like children are forgetting how to use a knife and fork, and constant things like that. That's all due to schools not being fully open, according to the media. But none of them will go, here's the system of controls the guidance say. How does that compare with infection control? There's no basis, no scientific basis. Nobody will do that. And equally, it seems that our opposition parties won't examine that. Not one of them will talk about the lack of scientifically recognised mitigations in school. They'll tinker around the edges and say, oh yeah, masks, they're all right for now, but they don't commit to anything. Nobody will examine that detail that we've had to do as parents, and that teachers working in these environments have had to do. They've looked at the detail and they've gone, that isn't infection control. That's hygiene theatre at best. That isn't stopping transmission. That isn't preventing unnecessarily exposing people to infection. So yeah, Lisa's right. We're asking the media, we're telling our stories, we're asking our individual MPs, we're asking councillors, we're going to, Lisa's done wonders with Wigan Trades Council, who've been fantastically supportive. We're trying to get trades councils to, on a local level, lobby for at least stop fining. If you can't do anything else, stop fining. Let parents have the choice, because I tell you now that there's an awful lot of parents who are sending their children to school, me included, that we're doing so for lots of different reasons, and some people are doing it just because they don't want that threat of prosecution and fines. So if you take that away, let's see how much those classrooms empty and there's more room for social distancing. And there's one of the mitigations sorted already.
Yeah. I have a friend who's doing it just because she's tired of fighting. She's lost her dad over Christmas like me, and she just can't take anymore. And they were bullying and bullying and bullying, and she just said, I can't take anymore, I'm just going to send her back.
Yeah. But you get it, don't you? I mean, that people like me, I'm a social worker by background. And, when the schools start talking about safeguarding and referring you to safeguarding, and it's a child welfare issue, I mean, that completely undermines your professional career, and you would end up struck off. So there's lots of different reasons why people have ended up forced into this position. And as you said, you know, by accident rather than design, they would end up with safer schools if they simply allowed more people to exercise a choice and say, look, weighing up the risks out there in the community, the school does not feel safe for me and my family. We're going to stay home. We're able to remote learn, you know, make that available. That's another thing we've seen. We've seen threats of fines, threats of safeguarding, and actually some of the parents in our group have actually had remote learning removed. You know, it's bullying behaviour. You know, if that isn't abuse. So that's what we'd like to see. I think, you know, make this, because everybody is struggling to cope with, and it's unknown, and everybody uses the word unprecedented. So, you know, let's shift away and try and work together, support parents and say, look, based on your individual circumstances, what's the best situation for you and your family? Let's work with that. What's the best thing for this school? Because we've heard about schools that are next to busy main roads. You know, one teacher this week said they'd close the windows because it was noisy outside. So we need a parent by parent or family by family solution. We need a school by school solution. Local authorities, I mean, my local authority had the highest number of fines in November and December in Yorkshire, compared to the neighbouring local authority, which has taken a no fines approach. So it's like, look at your own local communities, your populations, and decide what's best for you. And we need the support of our trade unions and our activists and our MPs.
And our elected representatives, even city councillors, county councillors, you know.
Yeah.
You've got county councils doing it, and obviously you've got a certain amount of Labour members on those county councils, and they're not speaking out against it.
No. Lisa?
I just want to, oh, I'm so sorry, Damien. Sorry. It was just a very brief note picking up on something that Sucra said. I know of a school in Wigan, and this is the thing, it's not even a postcode lottery, it's a head teacher lottery in some cases. And it highlights how anarchic the system is. The head has said to his parents, I cannot guarantee that your child will not catch COVID in my school. I cannot guarantee I can keep them safe with all the best will in the world. Let me know how I can support you. If you don't want to send your child in, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to send them in. If you want to send them in for a certain amount of time, we'll work with that and the sending work home. How can one head, and these children, they're not extremely vulnerable children, so they don't fall under that government cohort because they're not, you know, meant to be learning from home. How can one head be so empathetic and helpful? And then I've got a head teacher who is saying she's going to offer all of them and sending me a link to the council website with where I could go to jail for 3 months.
Yeah,
tell me how that's happening.
It's one head teacher's opinion over another, and that's what fundamentally has come about because there's no one line of direction being given to them. You've got some head teachers who choose to lead, and you've got others that choose to follow, and that is essentially the boat that we're in. And as you say, it is a bit of a lottery. But just to round up now, because we're nearly at the end of our time, sometimes we speak directly to Keir Starmer on this show, as he or his members of his team are known to watch socialist telly from time to time. So I'm going to, instead, for a change, I'm going to offer you guys that opportunity. Is there a message you'd like to send him or Kate Green about their responses so far and what you would like them to do? Anyone want to?
I'm not sure I can be polite. I'll do my best. I'd just like to say, stop disappointing us. Be in opposition. There is so much there. Look at the safety mitigation. It's an open goal for you. Look at it. Say, why are the system of controls written in this way? There's no resemblance on infection control. We want education to be safe and sustainable and fair to all. Why aren't you doing something? Stop disappointing us.
SafeEdForAll, thank you for joining us tonight. Please do follow them on Twitter at SafeEdForAll_UK or their website, SafeEdForAll.com. Are you all on social media? Would you like to give out your handle so that people can follow you?
Yeah. Mine's Care_excellence.
Care_excellent.
I'm just Claire Cosler.
You're just Claire Cosler? You're more than just Claire Cosler.
Yeah.
I'm
Sorry.
There you go. I'm Hoppy Soul.
You're at Happy Soul. Lisa, do you want to give yours out?
Yeah, I think I'm Sandy Boots 2020.
Fantastic. Myself and Sarah will be back next week. Thank you so much, SafeEd, for supporting left-wing media and for coming on to Socialist Telly. Cheers, folks.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.